Hi guys, I'm Talia's Threads and today we are making the Wavelength Tote Bag. Now this is the largest size in the pattern. It comes in 3 sizes. Today we will be making the medium. And then this is the smallest size. Isn't it so cute? And you'll notice that they all had circular openings in the handle. There is actually a triangle opening option, which is slightly larger than the circle, which can help with having a little bit more room to get your arm through. And the pattern does have a Welt zipper pocket, which works for the medium and large sizes. And if you want any inspiration, then my testers made some really amazing versions, which I'll put on the screen. So let's get into it. So for the main panel, you need to cut 2 outer fabric and 2 lining fabric. And then you need to cut 2 interfacing, but only for this dashed area that's above the line here. You can either trace this off and use it as a pattern piece, or I am just going to lay this over the edge of my interfacing and then just cut around it so that I don't have to trace one off. And then the pocket stitching line, you need to mark it on the right side of your fabric, but you can choose to put it on the inside of the bag, on the outside of the bag, wherever you like. Just mark the stitching line on the right side. And then for the pocket, which only works for the medium and large sizes, so if you're sewing the small, this won't fit into the bag, but you need to cut 1 of your lining fabric and then you need to mark the stitching line on the wrong side. So take your pocket piece and place it right sides facing with the main panel that you decided you want to add the pocket to. And then how I like to do it is put a pin through one of the corners and then match it to one of the corners that you've marked on the main panel, and you can do that on both sides and it will match up exactly. So take this to machine and stitch around the line. When you get to the corners, just drop the needle down into the project and then you can lift up the presser foot and twist the project, and so that you get a nice crisp corner on every one. I've just drawn on the line where you need to cut so that you can see exactly where you need to cut into the pocket, and you're going to go straight across the middle but not quite to the ends, and then you're going to come out in the shape of a Y towards the corners on both sides and come as close as you can to the stitching, but just make sure you don't snip your stitching because everything will come unraveled. Now push the pocket through the opening and to the back of the fabric, and it may take you a minute to sort of roll out the seams, but make sure they're sitting nice and flat and then give them a press. And you don't have to put pins around, but this fabric is a little shifty, so I'm going to add some pins to keep it in place. And this is a really good example of why you should choose a fabric that's stable and not slippery if you're a beginner, because really I'm having trouble getting this to stay flat. I know that I will be able to sew with it, but if you're new to sewing, then it just adds that other layer of difficulty. So now you have your opening pressed, go and top stitch around the edge at 1/16 of an inch or 0.15 centimeters. To attach the zipper, we're going to use double-sided seam tape, and I've just cut 2 lengths of 8 inches, and I'm going to really carefully stick them on the edge of the zipper. And then you can just really easily position the zip behind the pocket opening. And this is really sticky, but you should be able to like peel it off and reposition if you don't get it in the right place first time. And now you can just go and follow the same line of stitching from the last step and secure the zipper in place. And like we did before, drop the needle and lift the presser foot to pivot around the corners and give a really crisp stitching line. Now we're ready to close up the pocket. Before we do that, then you can trim off any zipper that's outside of the stitching line. But make sure when you're trimming the zipper that you are using some scissors that you have allocated for that, because if you use your fabric shears, that will blunt them very quickly. Now I'm just folding the pocket up to match the top, and we're going to sew around the 3 open edges at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And you can stitch from this side, but there is a little trick. I really like to stitch from this side and fold the main panel out of the way. And it really helps not to sew through any of the main panel because you've got that side facing up, so you can see if you're getting close. So you can work with one side at a time, or you can work with both at the same time if you like and work through the steps at the same time. I personally like to do all the steps on both together. I feel like it goes so much faster. And you're going to take your outer fabric and place it right sides facing with the lining fabric. And what we're matching up here is the inner circle or triangle, so the handle opening. And use your waves to sort of get it in the right place. And now I'm just going to put a few pins around. But basically we're going to be sewing around this inner edge at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Before we push one layer through the other to finish the hole, because this is curved, you do need to clip into the seam allowance. Clip through about 1/4 inch. Don't go through the stitching line because obviously everything will unravel. And if you're doing the triangle opening, you may not need to snip into the straighter portions, but just make sure you snip into the curved portions so that it can sit nice and flat. Now flip one side through the other, and you might want to just like roll the seams between your fingers a little bit to get them sitting flat, and then press. Now we're ready to attach all the layers together. And so you're going to lay out one with the right side facing down, and then lay the other on top with the lining facing to the lining. So the right side is facing out on both sides, because even though you usually go right side facing, we're not flipping this. We're bias binding the edges without flipping it, so the outer fabric needs to be facing out right now. And It can be a bit tricky to match all of the corners up, especially like if you have a slightly shifty fabric like I do. My lining is quite non-stretchy, and then my linen is sort of like a loose weave. So do the best you can. And we are going to trim the seams a little bit in a minute. So if you do need to trim a tiny bit, then don't worry. But I would sew them all together and then try and trim afterwards. And when you're sewing something like this together ready for the next step, usually you call it basting. And basting is like a long straight stitch where you put your stitch length right up, and then you sew without back stitching. Now, I don't call this basting in the instructions. I just say to sew around at 1/8 inch or 0.3 centimeters. And that is because if you use a long stitch, it can be really difficult to get around all the tight curves. So I actually leave my machine at like my standard, which is 2.5, or I may even turn it down to be a shorter stitch length of like 2 or 1.5 if I'm really struggling to get around the curves. And if you feel like you're not quite hugging the curve enough, then it's totally fine to just drop the needle into the project and lift the presser foot and pivot the project around. Really take your time with this, because the feature of the bag is the beautiful curves. So if you haven't quite got them, then you'll lose one of the most beautiful features of the bag. So now I'm just going to check all my layers and trim away where it's seems like it's really overhanging, but don't trim too much, and try and preserve the curves of the pattern, because if you trim too much away, obviously you're going to lose the definition on the curves. And in the valley portions, I do find it quite hard to get my fabric scissors in, so if you have any nice sharp thread snips, you can get like these smaller scissors in there much easier. So to make your own bias tape, you need to take your fabric and cut it at a 45-degree angle. Now, if you have a quilting ruler, there should be lines on your ruler. I'm not sure if you can see that, but this is the 45-degree angle line on my ruler, and I'm going to line that up with the selvage edge of the fabric and just cut straight along with my rotary cutter. Now you have your 45-degree angle line, and if you line up the ruler with the edge, you will get perfect bias strips every time. However, if you don't have one of these rulers and you don't know how to get a 45-degree angle, what you can do, and this only works if the fabric was cut straight, so if your fabric was cut wonky, then you'll have to try another option, but fold the selvage edge along so it's in half, matching the cut edge. So if you still had the whole piece of fabric, it would look like this. And as you can see, you can cut along. So I take my fabric and I line it up the folded edge straight with my cutting mat, and then I can cut at a 90-degree angle from that and get perfect bias strips. So for 1/4 inch bias binding, you may think that you'd cut 1 inch wide. However, you need to consider the fact that the bias tape is going to be folded and you're going to lose a tiny bit of width each time, and then to accommodate going around the seams and things. So actually you cut it at 1.25 inches wide. Now you have your bias strips. You can attach these right sides facing. This fabric doesn't really have a right and a wrong side. However, if yours does, try and pay attention to that. And you're going to place them at a 90-degree angle to each other, and you're going to stitch diagonally across. And you want the stitching line to meet where the fabric joins on each one. Otherwise, once you fold this back open, they won't match up properly. If you have a long seam allowance, then you can trim some off, and I'm just trimming the fluffy edges from the selvage of mine. And then press each seam allowance open. And then trim the little excess triangles off. Now, if you have a bias tape maker, then you can make this however you want. But the way that I like to do it is manually, and I do it in 2 passes. So on the first pass, I'm just going to press the bias tape in half all the way down. And then for the second pass, I start off by folding one edge into the middle. And then you can fold the other edge into the middle and match them up. And then you should be able to just tuck them into the middle where they meet and move the iron along. It's a little fiddly at first, but once you get down far enough, you can put a pin into your mat to hold the bias tape in place, and then the tension that this creates allows you to fold it much easier. So now you can just give a slight pull on it and fold the edges in, and it goes really quickly. And then you can just move the bias tape along and repin and keep going. So I put my bias tape on this little piece of card just because I feel like it helps to control the project while you're doing it a little bit more. And I'm going to start at the bottom, even though I'm going to show you a way to finish off the bias tape neatly. I just want to make sure it's out of the way. And I'm not going to pin the bias tape around because it will shift as you're sewing it, but just go really slow. Hug the curves as best you can, and if you give a tiny bit of a stretch in the valley portions, then you shouldn't have too much bunching. And then this little tail I'm leaving here is 3 inches long, and it's just going to allow us to finish the tape neatly at the end. So now I've got almost around to the end, and I have 2 little tails here, and what you need to do is walk the bias tape around the seam, and I'm just going to trim a little bit of this one off. So walk it around, and I'm just going to pin that there. I'm going to walk this one around, and from where they meet, I'm going to measure down the same width as the bias tape unfolded. So this bias tape is 1.25 inches wide total, so I'm going to overlap them by 1.25 inches. And then you can just trim off the excess. Now you can take these two ends and overlap them right sides facing at a 90-degree angle, and I'm just going to pin them in place. So I hope you can see this, but what you need to do is sew diagonally from corner to corner, and then once you trim that off you can iron the seam allowance open and it should perfectly fit along the seams. I'm just gently pressing that seam allowance open, and then I'm going to go and attach this last little bit. And you can pin this bit down if you want, but you don't have to. I find it helps me to match it up perfectly. Okay, and now it's time to fold the bias tape around to the back, and I'm going to use clips because it gets to be quite a lot of layers of fabric at this point, so if you try to pin through it you may not be able to. Just play around with the bias tape, and if you really can't fold it over the seam you can always go in and trim a tiny bit off and then try again. And then just go to the machine and stitch 1/16 inch away from this edge here. Alternately, if you want to give a really beautiful invisible finish, you can stitch this down by hand. I really think it makes it look beautiful. And if you would like to see how I did that on my wavelength bag, you're very welcome to go and check out that tutorial, but for this one I will be stitching on the machine.